Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive.
Hmm.
Ever catch yourself making a decision and it just feels like you instantly know the right answer? Or like you size up a whole situation in like a split second?
It's like our brains are working on autopilot sometimes.
Totally. Well, we're going to unpack all that and so much more as we take a look at Thinking Fast and Slow by the Nobel Prize winner, Daniel Kahneman.
Such a fascinating book. It really dives deep into how we think. And, one of the core ideas in the book is this concept of two systems of thinking.
Two systems, huh? I'm already intrigued.
Yeah. He calls them System 1 and System 2.
Okay, so like two different modes our brains can be in.
Kind of. Think of System 1 as like your brain's autopilot. Super fast, intuitive, and relies a lot on emotions and instincts. It's what lets you instantly know if someone's voice sounds hostile or if you need to like swerve your car to avoid something.
Ah, so it's like our rapid response system, the one that helps us get through everyday life without like overthinking every little thing.
Exactly. Now, System 2 is more like the deliberate, analytical part of our thinking. It's the system that kicks in when you're solving a really complex problem, like if you're doing your taxes, or when you need to concentrate super hard on something.
Gotcha. So system one is like the quick thinker, and system two is like the slow and steady one.
That's a great way to put it.
But they must work together somehow, right? Like, is it a constant battle between the two?
It can feel like that sometimes. System 1 is always on, running in the background, generating all these impressions, feelings, and intuitions. Then System 2 tends to only step in if System 1 runs into something it can't figure out right away, or when we consciously decide to think really hard about something.
Interesting. So it's like system one is calling the shots most of the time, and system two is only there as backup.
Yeah, you could say that. And that setup is super efficient most of the time. But, and this is key, it can sometimes lead to predictable errors in our judgment, what Kahneman calls heuristics and biases.
Ooh, heuristics and biases sounds kind of technical.
It's not as complicated as it sounds. Heuristics are basically mental shortcuts that our brains use, especially System 1, to make judgments quickly. They're super helpful for navigating the world, but sometimes these shortcuts can lead us to make mistakes.
So it's like, in the name of efficiency, our brains sometimes cut corners and end up with the wrong answer.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you give me an example of that, like one of these heuristics leading to a bias?
Well, think about how after a big plane crash is on the news, all of a sudden everyone's afraid of flying.
Oh, right, even though flying is statistically still one of the safest ways to travel.
Exactly. It's because that event, the plane crash, is fresh in our minds, so it feels a lot more probable than it really is. This is what's called the availability heuristic. Our System 1 is jumping to conclusions based on what's easily available in our memory.
So the easier it is to recall something, the more likely we think it is to happen. That makes sense.
Right. Our brains love to categorize things and make quick judgments. Makes things easier, but sometimes those judgments lead to biases. And these biases, well, they get even stronger because our brains tend to favor what Kahneman calls cognitive ease over cognitive strain.
Cognitive ease. Does that mean our brains like to think about stuff that's easy to process?
Pretty much. Our brains would rather coast along effortlessly whenever possible. System 2, it's a bit lazy, it takes effort to fire it up, and we only have so much mental energy to go around, right?
So we're more likely to fall for these biases when we're tired or stressed out.
Absolutely. When we're mentally drained, we're less likely to engage that System 2 thinking. That means we're more susceptible to those quick judgments, even if they're biased. Makes you wonder if we're really as in control of our decisions as we think we are.
Right, so what can we do about it?
Well, awareness is the first step, right? Just knowing about these biases can help us catch ourselves in the act. And that leads us to another big idea from the book, what Kahneman calls the illusion of understanding. It's like our brains are always trying to create a coherent story, even if we don't have all the information.
Oh, that's so true. It's like when you only see a tiny part of a situation, but your mind instantly fills in the blanks, makes up a whole story, even if it might be wrong.
Exactly. Kahneman calls this what you see is all there is, or WYSAD. Our System 1 often works with just a little bit of information and jumps to conclusions without considering what's missing or what might contradict the story it's creating.
I do this all the time with online reviews, read a couple of good reviews about a product and I'm ready to buy it, completely forgetting to scroll down and see if there are any bad reviews that might tell a different story.
Perfect example. That's WYSII in action. We base our judgments on the information that's easiest to access, often forgetting to look for other perspectives. And this can lead to overconfidence in our judgments, making us think we know more than we actually do.
It's like our brains are hardwired to create these neat little narratives, even if they don't actually reflect the full picture.
Exactly. And this tendency to jump to conclusions can get even stronger with something called the halo effect. That's where we form an overall positive impression of someone based on just one good trait, even if that trait has nothing to do with, the bigger picture.
Oh, I've totally done this. Like when you meet someone who's super charming and you just automatically assume they must also be intelligent and trustworthy, even though those things aren't necessarily connected.
That's it. We generalize from one positive thing to a whole positive assessment, even if it doesn't make logical sense. Just another way that System 1 can steer us wrong sometimes.
Okay, so it seems like System 1, while super efficient, can be a bit of an unreliable narrator, right? Always making snap judgments and weaving stories, and we're not always aware of the biases that are shaping those stories.
That's a great way to sum it up. And it all ties into another fascinating piece of the puzzle, the influence of optimism and overconfidence.
Optimism. I thought that was a good thing.
It can be. But Kahneman points out that we humans, we tend to have this built-in optimistic bias. We often overestimate our abilities and how likely things are to go well, even when experience tells us otherwise.
Like that classic planning fallacy, right? Underestimating how long it takes to finish a project. I'm definitely guilty of that one. It's like we're wired to believe things will go smoothly, even though they rarely do.
Exactly. And while a bit of optimism can be helpful to get us started, it can also lead to unrealistic expectations and poor decisions. It's particularly interesting to think about this when it comes to entrepreneurs.
Right. You need that optimism to take the leap and start a business, but you also need a dose of realism to navigate the inevitable challenges that come with it.
That's the balance. It's a double-edged sword. And speaking of challenges, there's another big player in all of this we can't ignore: loss aversion.
Loss aversion. I've never heard of that. What is that?
Basically, it means we feel the pain of a loss more strongly than we feel the pleasure of an equal gain. It's like, how they say it hurts more to lose $100 than it feels good to find $100?
Yeah, I get that. Losing something always feels way worse than gaining something of the same value.
Exactly. And this loss aversion, it has a huge impact on our decisions in every part of life. Our finances, relationships, everything. It can make us avoid taking risks, even when those risks could lead to big rewards.
It's like we're more focused on avoiding pain than on seeking pleasure.
That's a really good way to put it. And this ties into another interesting concept called the endowment effect.
Okay, endowment effect, another new one.
It's the idea that we tend to overvalue the things we own just because we own them, even if we wouldn't pay that much to buy them in the first place.
Oh, yeah. It's like when you try to sell something you own and you think it's worth way more than anyone else is willing to pay. Like, we get attached to our stuff and it inflates the value in our minds.
Exactly. It's hard for our brains to separate the actual value of something from, the sentimental value or the memories we attach to it.
Wow, so we've got these two systems, one fast, one slow. And we're constantly bombarded by biases like availability, halo effect, loss aversion. It's like we're playing a game against our own minds.
That's a good analogy. But the good news is, understanding these biases is the first step to winning that game. It helps us recognize those subtle influences and make smarter choices in all areas of our lives.
It's like knowing the rules gives you a better chance of winning,
Right.
right? So how do we use this knowledge to make better decisions?
Well, that's something we can explore further as we continue our deep dive. But for now, just knowing these biases exist is a huge advantage. It allows us to at least start questioning our assumptions.
Right. And maybe avoid making those snap judgments that we might regret later. Well, this has been a fascinating start. It feels like we're just scratching the surface of thinking fast and slow.
There's so much more to explore.
Definitely.
Welcome back. It's great to be diving back into Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow with you. We've got some really interesting stuff to uncover in this part. We're going to be looking at some pretty mind-bending concepts like how our brains deal with numbers and statistics and that whole tricky business of predicting the future.
Sounds good to me. I'm ready for more. Last time we were talking about heuristics and biases, how System 1 is always making those snap decisions based on mental shortcuts. So I'm really curious to hear more about how that all works when we're dealing with things like numbers and probabilities. It's like, are we even equipped to handle that stuff intuitively?
That's a really great question. And yeah, it turns out our intuition can lead us astray in some pretty predictable ways when numbers are involved. One really fascinating thing Kahneman talks about is this thing called the anchoring effect. Basically, it means our judgments can be heavily influenced by the first number we see, even if that number is totally random and has nothing to do with the actual decision we're making.
So it's like our brains get stuck on that first number, like it's an anchor, even if it's pulling us in the wrong direction.
Exactly. It's like that initial number sets a frame of reference, and that we tend to adjust our thinking from there, even if we know logically that it's not a good place to start. Like imagine you're trying to haggle over the price of something, say a used car.
Okay, yeah, I'm following you.
And the seller, they start by throwing out a ridiculously high price. Now, even if you know it's way too much, that number might still influence you. Like you might end up offering more than you would have if they'd started with a more reasonable number.
Ah, I see. That makes sense. It's like that first number becomes this benchmark in our minds, even if it's totally off base.
Right. And this anchoring effect, it happens everywhere. It can affect how much we think a house is worth, how we judge a company's performance, even how we see our own abilities. It's a good reminder that our system one, that fast, intuitive part of our brains, can be influenced by things that seem totally irrelevant.
Okay, so it's like we've got to be extra careful when we're dealing with numbers because our gut feeling might not be so reliable. And this kind of makes me think about another area where our intuition can sometimes fail us. Statistics. Like, I know we should pay attention to data and evidence, but it can all feel so overwhelming sometimes.
That's totally understandable. And you've hit on another important point that Kahneman brings up. He talks about this thing called the belief in the law of small numbers.
Okay, what does that mean? Belief in the law of small numbers.
It's this tendency we have to draw big conclusions from very little data. Like we might see a pattern in just a handful of cases and assume it applies to everyone, even though that's statistically, probably not true.
So it's like we see a few people doing something and we assume that everyone's doing it, even if that's not actually the case.
Exactly. Like let's say you're at a new restaurant.
Okay, picturing it.
And you see a few people leaving and they all look happy. You might think, oh, this place must be amazing.
Right, because those people looked satisfied.
Which you don't really know. Maybe they're just having a good day, or maybe they're friends with the owner, It's just a small sample. You'd need to see a lot more people to get a real sense of whether the food is actually good.
That's a good point. It's so easy to jump to conclusions based on just a few examples.
It is. And it's something to be mindful of, especially when we're consuming information, like reading news articles or research studies.
Right, like just because a study finds something in a small group of people, that doesn't mean it applies to everyone.
Exactly. We need to consider things like sample size, how many people were actually involved in the study, and whether the findings have been replicated by other researchers.
So it's like we've got to train ourselves to think more statistically, to look at the big picture and not get carried away by those small-scale patterns that might not mean anything.
Absolutely. And speaking of patterns, there's another statistical concept that's really helpful to understand. Regression to the mean.
Okay, regression to the mean. What is that?
It's a fancy way of saying that things tend to even out over time. Like extreme events, those really high highs or low lows, they're usually followed by something more, average.
So if someone has like a really amazing performance one time, they're probably not going to be able to do that again right away.
Exactly. They're more likely to perform closer to their usual level the next time. Like let's say a golfer has a phenomenal round and shoots way below their average score. It's pretty unlikely they'll be able to do that again in the very next round.
Gotcha. So it's like things tend to balance out over time.
Yeah. Exactly. And this applies to all sorts of things, not just golf, like student test scores, company profits, you name it. It's a really powerful force that's often overlooked.
It is. It's like we tend to attribute these fluctuations to skill or effort, but a lot of times it's just, random chance.
Right. And this brings us back to that illusion of understanding we talked about earlier. We look at things in hindsight. Everything seems to make sense, but that's because we already know how the story ends, right? We create these neat narratives, but we often ignore the role of chance and all the other factors that could have led to different outcomes.
It's like we're fooled by hindsight. We think we could have predicted it all along, but in reality, we probably couldn't have.
That's exactly it. And this illusion of understanding, well, it can lead us to make some pretty bad assumptions about the future. We overestimate how much control we have, how well we can predict things. We underestimate the role of chance.
So it's like we need a little humility to remember that we don't have all the answers, and the world's a lot more unpredictable than we like to think it is.
Absolutely. It's about being open to different possibilities, acknowledging what we don't know.
Well, this is definitely making me think about things in a new way. It's, like you said, mind-bending.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah,
But these are the kinds of insights that can really help us understand ourselves better.
totally agree. And sounds like there's even more to come.
Oh, yeah. We're just getting started. There are so many more fascinating concepts to explore in Kahneman's work.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into thinking fast and slow. It's amazing how much we've uncovered already about, like, the hidden workings of our own minds.
It's really eye-opening, isn't it?
Yeah.
And in this last part, we're going to tackle some even bigger questions, like how we deal with risk and uncertainty, and even what Kahneman has to say about, living a good life.
Sounds like a great way to wrap things up. I'm ready. So in the last part, we were talking about how our intuition can be kind of wonky when it comes to numbers and statistics. I'm curious to hear more about how that plays out when we're dealing with, like, risky situations where the stakes are high.
That's a really important area, for sure. And one of the things Kahneman does in the book is he really challenges those traditional economic models that assume people are always, like, perfectly rational when they make decisions. He argues that our emotions and psychology, they play a much bigger role than we often realize, especially when it comes to risk.
So we're not always those, like, cool and calculating decision makers that we like to think we are.
Not always.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the key insights in the book is this idea of the fourfold pattern. It basically describes how we tend to be more risk-averse when it comes to potential gains, but more risk-seeking when we're facing potential losses.
Okay, I think I'm following you. So, like, if we're offered a gamble where we have an equal chance of winning or losing the same amount of money, we're more likely to avoid that gamble because the potential loss feels scarier than the potential win.
Exactly. We're wired to avoid those threats, even if it means missing out on opportunities that could actually be, like, statistically in our favor. It's where that whole loss aversion thing really kicks in.
I can totally relate to that. I remember this one time I was offered a promotion at work, and it was a great opportunity, but it also meant taking on more responsibility. And I was so worried about, like, messing up or failing that I ended up turning it down, even though looking back, the upside could have been huge.
That's a perfect example of how loss aversion can play out in our lives. That
Yeah.
fear of a potential loss, it can loom so large in our minds that we don't even see the potential gains, even if those gains could be way bigger.
It's like we're hardwired to play it safe, even if it means missing out on some amazing opportunities.
That's such a great way to put it. And this tendency to, like, overemphasize potential losses, it can show up in all sorts of decisions, from how we invest our money, to how we negotiate, to how we approach new challenges.
So it's not just about being aware of our emotions, but also understanding how those emotions might be, like, distorting our view of risk and shaping the choices we make.
Exactly. And speaking of distorted perceptions, Kahneman also talks about how we tend to misjudge the probabilities of rare events. We often either completely ignore them or we give them way more weight than they deserve, especially when those events are, like, vivid or emotionally charged.
Oh, that's so true. Like, when you see a news story about, like, a shark attack and suddenly you're terrified of going in the ocean, even though the chances of actually being attacked by a shark are incredibly small.
That's it. Our system,
Yeah.
one, it loves those dramatic, memorable events, but it's not always so good at figuring out how likely they actually are to happen.
It's like, it's not just about the numbers themselves, but about the stories we create around those numbers, the emotions we attach to them. And sometimes those stories can really hijack our rational thinking.
They really can. And it makes you think about how we consume information, how we assess risk, how we make sense of a world that's full of uncertainty and complexity.
It's like we need to develop a healthy dose of skepticism to question our assumptions and look beyond those, like, attention-grabbing headlines to get a more accurate picture of what's really going on.
I couldn't agree more. And it's interesting because this leads to another really important point that Kahneman makes about the limits of expertise. He argues that even experts in really complicated fields, they're often no better at predicting the future than chance, especially when it comes to, like, things with lots of variables or things that happen over a long period of time.
Hold on, are you saying that all those experts we see making predictions about, like, the economy or politics,
Yeah.
they might not actually know what they're talking about?
It's not that they don't have knowledge or experience. It's more that they often overestimate how well they can predict what's going to happen in these really complex systems. They see patterns where there aren't any. They create narratives to explain things that might just be random. And they believe they have more control than they probably do.
So even with all their expertise, they're still susceptible to those same cognitive biases that we've been talking about.
Exactly. Kahneman actually found that simple algorithms, like based on statistical data and objective criteria, they often do a better job at predicting things than even the most experienced experts.
That's kind of mind-blowing. So sometimes a simple formula can be more accurate than someone with years of experience?
It can. It reminds us to be careful about putting too much faith in expert opinions, especially when those opinions are based on, like, intuition or subjective judgment. We should always try to look for, evidence and data when we can.
So it's like we need to find that sweet spot between skepticism and open-mindedness.
Right.
Question everything, but also be willing to change our minds when we see new evidence.
That's a great way to put it. And all this connects to another fascinating idea from the book, framing effects.
Okay, framing effects. I'm all ears.
It's basically the idea that the way choices are presented to us, how they're framed, can drastically change the decisions we make, even when the options themselves are logically the same.
So it's not just about the information itself, but how that information is, like, packaged and presented to us.
That's it. Like, imagine you're a doctor and you're talking to a patient about two different treatment options.
Okay.
One option has a 90% survival rate. The other has a 10% mortality rate.
So basically the same thing, just worded differently.
Right. But studies show that people are way more likely to choose the option framed in terms of survival, even though the outcomes are identical.
Wow. So it's like we're susceptible to these subtle cues that can nudge us in one direction or another without us even realizing it.
That's exactly right. And this has huge implications for how we design policies, how we communicate, even how we make personal decisions. We need to be aware of the power of framing, to question those assumptions behind the choices we're given, and make sure our decisions are really reflecting our own values.
It's like we need to become more conscious consumers of information, more aware of the ways we might be manipulated, even if it's unintentional, just by how things are presented to us.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And as we wrap up our exploration of thinking fast and slow, I think it's really important to touch on what Kahneman has to say about, happiness and well-being. Because after all, isn't that ultimately what we're all striving for?
Yeah, definitely. So what does Kahneman say about how to live a good life?
Well, he dives deep into this, drawing on all his research on cognitive biases and decision-making. And he introduces this idea of two selves. The experiencing self, which is all about how we feel in the present moment, and the remembering self, which is the part of us that looks back and evaluates our lives based on our memories.
Interesting. So the experiencing self is all about the here and now, and the remembering self is more about how we, reflect on those experiences later.
Exactly. And it's interesting because sometimes those two selves can have different priorities. We might make choices that make us happy in the moment, but that don't necessarily create lasting memories, or we might go through tough experiences that we later come to see as valuable or meaningful, even though they weren't exactly enjoyable at the time.
It's like we're constantly trying to balance what feels good right now with what we'll be happy about in the long run.
It's a constant juggling act, and Kahneman suggests that we often prioritize that experiencing self, even when it's not in our best interest in the long term. Like we chase those fleeting pleasures that don't really leave a mark, and we avoid those challenges that could lead to real growth and fulfillment.
So how do we find that balance between those two selves, between short-term happiness and that long-term sense of fulfillment?
That's the million-dollar question. And Kahneman, he suggests that we focus on things like experiences that create lasting memories, building strong connections with people, finding meaning and purpose in what we do, practicing gratitude. These are all things that contribute to a life well lived.
That's beautiful. It's not just about seeking pleasure or avoiding pain, but about creating a life that's rich in meaning and connection.
Couldn't agree more. And I think that's a perfect place to leave our exploration of thinking fast and slow.
This has been such an amazing journey. We've covered so much ground, from those two systems in our heads to all those biases that can trip us up. I feel like I've learned so much about myself and the world around me.
Me too. Kahneman's work is so insightful, so thought-provoking. It shows us where we're vulnerable, but it also gives us the tools to make better choices.
So as we go about our days, making those big and small decisions, let's remember those two characters, System 1 and System 2, and that dance between intuition and reason. Let's be mindful of the biases that might be lurking in the shadows. And let's strive to make choices that are truly aligned with our values and hopes and dreams.
That's what it's all about.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into thinking fast and slow. We hope you found it as insightful and engaging as we did, and we encourage you to pick up the book and continue exploring the amazing world of your own mind.